we all should have access to a great library. We should all have access to information so that we can go search for truth and find accurate, verified information.
This is Educating to be Human, and I'm your host, Lisa Petrides, founder of the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management in Education. In each episode, I sit down with ordinary people creating extraordinary impact, people who are challenging notions of how we learn, why we learn, and who controls what we learn. Thank you very much for listening. I am delighted to speak with Chris Freeland, the Director of Library Services at the Internet Archive. And if you don't know them, their mission is simple: universal access to all knowledge. I've asked him to join me to talk about the state of libraries today in terms of barriers to access, what's going on with digital rights. You might even be thinking, what does that even mean, digital rights, and how does that impact what libraries do? And a central question of this season of Educating to be Human is to think about who controls what we learn and how we as a society support cultural memory. And why libraries? Because libraries are critical to this. They're an essential part of how we learn. And today, as we know, the very existence of libraries is being challenged and honestly makes many of us in the field a bit nervous when we think about the enormity of how libraries have been supporting learning in the past. So welcome, Chris, and I am delighted to have you here today to help untangle this a bit so we can gain a better understanding of libraries, of the past, present, and of course of the future.
Thanks, Lisa. Great to be here.
So I would like to just start with sort of some general questions, like how would you define the role of libraries in society today?
That's a great question. As a librarian, we think about this a lot. And actually, that was one of the things that I enjoyed most about my time in library school. I'm a later in life librarian, so I came to get a second master's degree in library and information science in my late 30s. And what I loved most about that program was learning about library history and the role of libraries in society. And what you learn through these programs and through these studies is that the pressures and the challenges that libraries are facing today are not dissimilar from the pressures and challenges that libraries have been facing since they started. There are differences, obviously, time does make a difference, but libraries have been facing this challenge of letting people know that we are an important part of our communities and why we should be funded, why we should play this important role. So what is the role of libraries in society? I think there are a few. If you look back, the great American experiment with libraries started with Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. And that was like 1889 was the first Carnegie Library. So we've had 135 years of this American library experience. And to me, I see that there are kind of three ways that libraries really, like the roles that libraries have in society. And you'll see them, and some of them may seem unusual. This is what people think of for libraries: access to information. You go to the library to check out a book, or you go to your library to get access to possibly newspapers or magazines or other reading materials or AV materials. So it's that access to information. It's also not just access, but also preservation. So holding on to our cultural memory and giving people access to it. So that's number one. That's, people see that. Libraries are also community hubs. So we're gathering spaces. Libraries are the place where people hang out around ideas. We're an important third space in the world. If you have your home space and your workspace, then there's this other place where you need to be to do interesting things. And libraries fill that for many people. So community hubs and gathering places is a second one. But the third one, role of libraries in society that most people may not quite have the visibility towards, is the the civic services that libraries provide. So, reading programs, literacy programs, things like workforce development, the job assistance. You can go into your local public library and get help filling out an online job application. That is an incredibly important role, that workforce development, those job opportunities. So, those are some of the things like that civic service center is maybe one that people aren't as familiar with and don't experience as much, but it's just as important as that one that we do think of, which is access to information.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, as someone grew up in a library, I can see all of those actually. But that's not necessarily what how people are experience libraries today. Although they certainly are online. We have a fabulous local library where I live, and it is absolutely a community space, which is amazing. Are there particular barriers today that libraries are facing? It's really interesting to have you put this in perspective of, the 1800s and the origin of libraries here in the US. What are some of the barriers that you're seeing libraries face today as they try to make knowledge accessible and provide community spaces?
All we have to do is look at the headlines of any major newspaper or news outlet over the past couple of years, really, to see what's happening with libraries from the sort of the public sphere. There's book bans, libraries being defunded, challenges to library boards and to the roles of libraries. Like that's happening every day, and we're seeing that in the news. And I think many of us have a strong negative reaction to that and want to protect libraries. So that's certainly happening. And that has always been happening in libraries. There have always been community members who have fought against libraries having certain kinds of materials or making certain services available. Like it's just been there since the start of American libraries, since those Carnegie libraries. There are new things that are happening now, though, in these barriers, and that's things like cyber attacks. So the British Library was taken offline for almost a year. Parts of its collection are still minimally available because of a cyber attack. The Internet Archive faced a cyber attack last October that took us offline for a couple of days at a really important time just before the U.S. election. So that's a new threat that we're seeing today for sure. And then there's kind of a more existential threat to the future of libraries and barriers to access to information. And that's the move from building library collections via an ownership model, like buying physical books, to what's happening today more and more, which is a licensing model, just leasing temporary access to collections rather than owning them outright.
Yeah, that is interesting. 30 years ago, I bought a book. I maybe made some comments in it, and then I lent it to you because I wanted you to, see this book too. And you even got to see what I had written in my book, right? Yeah, so we owned books. Of course, we didn't write in our library books. But today, so if you take that model to the library, it does seem like there's kind of this fundamental shift happening from ownership to licensing. And how have you seen this shift affect what libraries can actually offer their communities?
It's an interesting shift, and it has both good parts and bad. Digital is great. People want to access ebooks. They want to carry their books with them. The idea of loading up one device with, a library's worth of books or a week's worth of reading and taking that to the beach. Wow, that is amazing. As a book lover, I love that device. But I also buy physical books because I like owning them, and I like everything that you just described. I like to be able to write in a book. I like to be able to give it to a friend if it's something that I think that they should read. You can't do that with an ebook. Ebooks are really expensive for libraries to lease. Here's an example from Connecticut. I'm getting this data, by the way, from Readers First, which is an ebook advocacy organization that's doing really important work nationally. So a latest bestseller from Robin Cook, the medical thriller author, a library could buy it in print for $18, but it costs $55 to lease a digital copy that expires either after 26 checkouts or after 2 years, whichever comes first. That's the biggest problem with ebooks, which is that they are incredibly expensive and that the publishers are forcing libraries to enter into these contracts that that move away from the ownership model to the licensing model and are really putting, unreasonable terms around library use of books and access to information.
Yeah, that's astounding, really, those numbers that you just shared. Is this because the digital arena was something that was just fair game and publishers could charge what they wanted to? I mean, the difference, what did you say, 50 something dollars versus, buying the book for 18. When the library buys the book for $18, they have it forever. But now if things are licensed, you mean they can just go away?
Sure, that could just vanish off of your digital shelves without any warning, or you reach the end of your metered access and then it just vanishes. Poof, that book is gone and no longer available to your patrons. The higher dollar value that you have paid year over year or lend over lend for providing access to that book versus the model that I grew up with, which is a library buys a book in print and they keep it until it falls apart. And it certainly, I can guarantee that it takes a lot more than 26 lends or 2 years for a physical book to no longer be viable.
Well, this certainly illustrates a problem around preservation and access to resources, right? These things matter for the public good. What are we, this makes our digital memory, it seems so fragile in this way. Are there some ways that libraries are trying to support this very critical role in our I'm going to say as an educator, I care a lot about the educational ecosystem. It seems like preservation and access really matter, yet we have this very tenuous, fragile kind of digital memory of resources.
Yeah, there's always been a strong connection between the educational endeavor and the library work, right? There's, libraries are co-located in schools and libraries have close relationships with other educational organizations. So there's libraries, I see libraries and schools, education existing on a continuum, both providing access to information and helping people, learn more and become better. Librarians and libraries are concerned about this move toward these barriers to access, all of them, all the above, right? The book bans, the restructuring of the library mission and the leasing and the ownership models. So there are libraries and librarians are trying to stop this, and they're doing so by trying to affect change where they can, which is in some of their contracts, right? So if they're forced into licensing arrangements, at least can they try to get perpetual access to those books, whatever that means from that publisher or from that vendor? Can they work the ability to preserve copies into their licensing agreements? Can they work agreements for letting libraries do interlibrary loan with their digital collections into those agreements? So I think that librarians are clever in trying to make the emerging model look and work as much like the traditional model where it makes sense. And it really is around those issues of preservation. It's scary to think that flash forward in 20 years, our libraries could just be all digital and we could own nothing. And then that means we're just beholden to the corporate entities that own those books and that allow us to have access to them, as opposed to the model we have today, which is and have grown up with over centuries, where we could buy it, own it, and then it's up to the local library to determine when it leaves the collection. It's based
Right.
on local needs and the professional librarians, as opposed to some AI bot in the sky that's making a decision about what goes into your collection.
I'm curious, are there examples of how knowledge or this kind of cultural content has been removed or lost through these kinds of licensing or takedowns? Are we already seeing that happen?
Yeah, actively seeing it happen. I think one of the examples that people that both really hit readers and book lovers in important ways. So the first was from a few years ago, several years ago. Amazon recalled copies of 1984 off of people's Kindles. Just disappeared your copy of 1984. No warning, just gone. That's bad. That's especially
Of
bad
all
that
the
it's that
books,
book.
how
Right,
how,
exactly.
how
I mean,
prophetic.
they couldn't have picked a better example, actually, of the scary things that can happen when you don't own material. So that's one. The other one that's a little bit more recent, a couple years ago, is from Roald Dahl's books. The publisher Puffin Books updated passages across his catalog. This is, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach. The passages were updated. The book was edited without anyone knowing. And that's scary too. I think there's an important part of cultural preservation. Like, update the books, fine. Like new editions, that happens all the time in publishing. And hooray, that we can look at text and we can reimagine them or reevaluate them for the contemporary moment. But let us know.
Exactly.
Don't just go changing that stuff behind the scenes, because my memories are built on those texts. My thought about culture is built around my reading of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and those words that were there when I read it when I was 10 years old. I don't want that to change. Or if it does change, I want to know about it so that I can see what the change is and that I can, think about it in the current contemporary context. That's an interesting exercise, but I want to know.
Well, what it's really raising is, what happens when, I'm going to say, these publishing houses, these media conglomerates, they are these tech platforms. Like, I don't know the relationship between the publisher and Amazon and how that came to be, but what happens when these are the folks that get to decide what's worth keeping? I mean, I much rather trust my trained librarian who's been doing this for several decades and has had education around this. And for me, again, as an educator, this ties so much into these issues around, I'm just going to say it, representation and justice, right? This to me seems to be the issue.
Absolutely. The professional librarians are trained in collection development. We go through, as part of our training, we learn how to protect readers' rights, how to protect their right to read, the availability of materials. You don't get that necessarily. You don't get that same care from a computational analysis of your collections, and just making a decision based on the number of the most important things that have been frequently borrowed. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to have in your collection or what you should have in your collection to have a well-rounded collection to fit the needs of your local community. A good example of this, we work with a library nonprofit called Library Futures, and they wrote a research report about Hoopla. So Hoopla is another, content aggregator, digital content that they make available to libraries on license and subscription terms. But their catalog has become flooded with low quality, unvetted digital materials, like tens of thousands of books, which can skew search results, and it can really put forward like misinformation over quality content. And so that's the scary thing that can happen when the machines are just running without any human intervention. We can just get so much junk or AI slop in our collections that the collection is no longer useful. And so that is alarming.
The question that really drives me these days when I'm thinking about libraries is as you've said, who controls what we learn and therefore what we know? So I'm really curious from your perspective, how does that question play out in terms of access, and even what are the stakes for democracy and cultural memory?
I think of one of the library heroes that I learned about. His name's Frederick Morgan Crunden, and he didn't start the St. Louis Public Library where I'm located, but he was kind of the godfather, if you will, of the St. Louis Public Library, and he was the first president of the American Library Association back in the 1890s, I think, or early 1900s. Crunden was a big proponent of the free public library. He wanted libraries to be open and available to the public. He had inherited, through like a civic way, inherited this educational collection that was like a school collection that was a private library. Crunden wanted to make that collection open to the public. Let everybody have access to this collection, not just the rich people who can afford to send their kids to the private schools to have access to the private libraries. Everyone should have access to a great research library. I think that is an amazing ideal to chase. And I think that many librarians are driven by that view that we all should have access to a great library. We should all have access to information so that we can go search for truth and find accurate, verified information. To the question of who controls what we learn, I would hope that it's no one. in an ideal world, we would have unfettered access to information, to whatever it is we need to do the thing that we need to do, whether that's learning how to fix my car or to do research on Frederick Morgan Crunden and his history in libraries. I depend on libraries for that access, and I depend on libraries for that preservation, especially like in the example of Crunden. He did all of his writing in the 1800s. I need those archival materials to help understand this person in a contemporary context. So I want the library to own that information, and I want the library, the public library or the research library, to provide me access through its mission.
And I know that with your work at the Internet Archive, that you've had a very significant role in helping to, not just in policy, but in practice, safeguarding our collective knowledge, right? I know maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those initiatives. I know there's the Democracies Library. Would love to hear a little bit about that and what you're doing in that way.
Yeah, the Democracies Library is a great project. It's an effort to bring together the outputs of democracies. So this is the government data. If you think of all of the information that our government and other democracies, other governments put out, there's a lot of it. Like the US government is the largest publisher in the world. I think that still holds true. That certainly has been the talking point. I think it's still true today. But a lot of that information isn't necessarily accessible or digitally available in a form that people need to access it today, which is online, right? If it's not online, it's as if it doesn't exist today. So Democracies Library is an effort to try to bring together all of those digital resources, but as well as those analog resources, the stuff that hasn't ever been scanned yet and could be. The great thing about government data, that by and large, at least in the United States, is that most of it is in the public domain. It is the product of the government and therefore publicly available. So there are no restrictions or low restrictions on how you can digitize it and, redistribute the content. So it's great. You can scan like here currently the Internet Archive is scanning microfiche. Do you remember microfiche? The little card with a whole bunch of little.
I used it in grad school.
Yeah. Well, guess what? Nobody uses microfiche today because there's usually in an academic library, there's like one microfiche reader and 3 people who know how to use it, and they're never on staff at the time when you need it. Now, that's not necessarily the case. Libraries are well staffed, but it's a confusing format, and it's locked in. You can't search across the microfiche. So what the Internet Archive is doing is digitizing the microfiche so that we can put it online, so that we can index it, so that we can run OCR across it and search for it. And so that's what Democracies Library is doing. It's bringing together both those born digital materials, the PDFs that the governments are producing, right alongside all of the analog materials that the government has been publishing for decades.
Well, I have a question. So, if the government has been doing all this work around our, collective knowledge, what makes the role of an organization like the Internet Archive different? If the government is already doing these kinds of things around, safeguarding our collective knowledge, you're outside the government, you're an independent organization, you're an independent nonprofit. Is there something different there? And why do we need both of those roles?
It's funny, in this moment in time with the attacks on federal funding for libraries, some of the negatives that have been applied to the Internet Archive over the 27, 28 years of its history are actually positives now. It is an independent research library. It doesn't depend on federal funding to keep the lights on and keep the mission going. Those are advantages right now. And that's a good thing that the Internet Archive is independent. We can shift, and we can shift our priorities, and we can focus on new projects. So a good example is the end of term archive. Since 2004, the Internet Archive has worked on a project to record the websites for outgoing administrations at the time of every U.S. election. This year is no different. There's just more stuff that has been taken down this year than in years past. There's always a change. The whitehouse.gov always changes with every administration. It's important then to safeguard that information, to preserve it as a historical record, as a historical marker. That's why that project is so important, that end of term archive, because we need to hold on to what did our elected officials say at a given point in time and understand that is going to change because that's the very nature of the American experiment.
So with that independence, also it seems like it comes with a certain amount of risk or vulnerability even. You mentioned a little bit about some of the attacks on libraries, the book bannings, the boards that are being challenged. What does this really say about, the power and the vulnerability of, let's call them memory institutions, right? These are the organizations, institutions that we have, safeguarded to do this for us.
Libraries don't have the power, sadly. The power is concentrated with the lobbyist for the publishers, for the recording industry, for the trade organizations, and it's not for the libraries. So libraries are working on probably the most important work in America, making sure that everyone has equal access to information and to the materials that we need to read and to learn and to grow. But yeah, there are a lot of barriers. There are a lot of people who want to try to make that more difficult. And why? I couldn't tell you why. What I can say is that libraries are generally united front. We are working together. The library community is strong, and we are trying to constantly and consistently explain to our communities why libraries are important and why in terms of a public library, that continued funding, matters to the community, and in an academic setting, why continuing to prop up your library and continuing to use your library in a collegiate or academic environment is important.
I also have to say, as somebody who's very practical, or we could even say more activist oriented, are there some things that just ordinary people can do to resist this loss of access or this potential loss of access to knowledge, and to protect access, to protect the erasure of, cultural memory, etc.?
I think it starts with using your library. So check out books, go into the library, make friends with the people at the desk, or at least go up and say hi. Libraries are an important resource, and we don't understand the value of them until they go away. So use your library, use the services that it provides so that the library can tell its community, tell its board, here's who's using our collections. Here's why this is important. So the first thing is use your library. Beyond that, is get involved with your library board. If you're in a public library environment, we need good people supporting libraries who are making decisions about libraries. And you may say, well, I'm not a librarian. That's fine. But most of the people who are on library boards aren't librarians. But if you are committed to education, if you are committed to the vision of the American library system, please help.
That's a great recommendation to end on. Do you know if most boards, library boards, are they elected? Are they like public positions, or are they positions that people typically volunteer for, and then there's some kind of election process?
So the great thing about the American library system is that it's different everywhere. And that's actually helpful right now in this moment in time. Though there are national organizations like the American Library Association that, try to help with policy nationwide, public libraries are managed and administered by local municipalities, and each municipality has a different structure. In some cases, the library is aligned under like Parks and Rec, just as an administrative home, and other times it lives somewhere else in the hierarchy of the government. That's valuable and helpful because you can't take out the entire library system as a whole. To do so would mean having to take out the libraries in every local library, every municipality. So it's great that libraries are managed locally, and that the way that you get involved changes based on where you live. So the best way of finding out is talk with your local library, find out how the board is structured, find out how the library is funded, and find out where you can help.
So listeners, that's your to-do item from this podcast today. Go check out your local municipality and understand how your libraries are run and get involved. I can't think of a better next step here. Thank you so much. Chris, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been very enlightening about what's going on. I think both some in terms of illuminating the concerns, but also what we can do differently. Is there anything to add that I haven't asked you that you would like to add to the conversation?
If I could leave folks with one thought, it's that it's kind of circling back to where we started, that the challenges that libraries are facing today are not dissimilar from the challenges that libraries have faced for the past 135 years. It just feels more existential right now because there are a number of pressures. And in some ways, the library is being undercut and underserved in ways that it hasn't been in previous history. So what I would say is use your library, like show up, be a good citizen by supporting your library and asking how you can help.
Before we finish, I always like to leave space for one final question, something I ask all my guests. Can you make up the title of the book that you wish more people would read?
The Future of Libraries, a Love Story.
Love it. Love it. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today and for highlighting how libraries are not just about access, but about preservation and civic trust and cultural memory. As you've made clear, the shift from ownership to licensing in the digital world really threatens that mission, limiting what libraries can do and what communities are able to access. In this time of book banning and defunding and the like, it's more important than ever to stand with libraries. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the show this week. This has been Lisa Petrides with Educating to Be Human. If you enjoy our show, please rate and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can access our show notes for links and information on our guests. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky, at Edu2Be-Human. That is EDU to be human. This podcast was created by Lisa Petrides and produced by Eleni Theros. Educating to Be Human is recorded by Nathan Sherman and edited by Ty Mayer, with music by Orestes Kaletsos.